How has government regulation or involvement in technology evolved over time, and how do you perceive it needing to evolve to kind of meet what AI can do now?
There's been a lot of evolution of the relationship between government and technology. Before World War II, basically, they stayed out.
Terry Winograd, an American computer scientist and co-director of the Stanford Human-Computer Interaction Group. He is known for his work on natural language using the Shred-Lu program at the MIT Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. A mentor to visionaries, Winograd has played a pivotal role as advisor to industry giants, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, the creators of Google.
Where we're going with technology and how do we navigate the ethical and societal concerns that come along with all of that?
It's always been the case that new technologies change the nature of jobs. I think the real question that's behind what you asked is, how does having AI affect our views of people? We're now in a world where the basic sharing of trust about what people say and what they do has been shattered.
It's really an honor and a pleasure to have you here today. As someone who laid all of the early groundwork, I feel like, or much of the early groundwork for AI and human-computer interaction, your perspective is really valuable to me right now, especially as I'm working on a new book called Moonshot Moments, where I'm really focused on what it would take to usher in a new kind of human renaissance today. And the three main topics that I'm focused on for that being AI, transhumanism, and psychedelic-assisted therapy. My greatest question is whether someone like yourself is optimistic about the future with AI and its impact in that, and kind of understanding a little bit now your philosophy around, where we're going with technology and how do we navigate the ethical and societal concerns that come along with all of that. But before we get into all of that, I figured I would start with a little background on yourself. If you wouldn't mind telling me kind of where you grew up, what made you want to study mathematics and then later computer science, kind of that early spark and that story.
I grew up in a small town in Colorado, Greeley, not terribly small, tens of thousands, but not a big city. And
where in Colorado?
Greeley, which is 50 miles north of Denver.
Okay.
If you know Colorado geography, there's a whole strip of towns laid out right along where the prairie meets the mountains, because that's where there's water coming from the mountains and flat land coming from the prairie, and you can farm. Yes. So there's Denver, Greeley, Colorado Springs, Pueblo, a whole bunch. So it's along the Front Range, as we call it. And when I was like 3 years old and somebody said, what do you want to do when you grow up? I said, I want to be in the arithmetic business because I liked arithmetic, right? Yeah. So I, from the beginning, was interested in that. In high school, my science project that I did was a primitive sort of mixed digital analog computer. Really simple, trivial stuff, but for that day it was, this is talking early 1960s. Wow. So I was interested in that general kind of thing. I went to Colorado College, which did not have an engineering program. It was a liberal arts college, which I was very glad to be there, but ended up with a couple of opportunities to use computers when they were pretty rare. It wasn't they were around all the time. The first was they have something called a symposium. I think they still do, where there's a couple of weeks in January between terms when they do special programs. And one of them, they had brought in a small computer, Control Data 160. You probably don't know the old models, but and I got to just play with it, try things out. And then later that year, a doctor from Denver came to be the head of radiology at the hospital, Penrose Hospital in Colorado Springs. And he had gotten a grant to use a computer to calculate radiation dosage for treatment of cancer. Wow. So, and he had hired a programmer in Denver, but Colorado Springs, he called up the college and he said, do you have anybody who does programming? And they said, what, programming, what's that? We do have some math students.
Wow.
So I ended up working for him for the rest of my college career, and it was like my computer. I started in the early 1960s with a personal computer because it was sitting in a room and I was the only one who ever went in there. And
What did a computer in the 1960s look like? A personal computer?
like a desk.
A whole
It
desk.
looked like a big steel case industrial desk with a conning tower on the front and a whole lot of switches and lights.
Okay.
And I didn't know anything about computing. I didn't know anything about assemblers, compilers. So I actually programmed it by tittling the switches on the front of the console.
Wow.
Which was tedious, but
Yeah.
I would write out all the numbers, the octal numbers in a book and then key them in and so
Wow.
on. I did then discover assembly. And so after that, I used assembly code on what was called a flexo writer, which was a typewriter that punched paper tape.
Okay.
So you could type in your
Yes.
things, punch the paper tape, feed the paper tape, and that was the only I/O the computer had was paper tape.
Wow.
So it was great. I mean, it was learning it from the bottom up, and I reduplicated. When I looked later, I said, "Oh yeah, I could have used a package for this or that or the other," but I didn't know. I just built them all. So by the time I was finishing college, I was definitely interested in computers, and I had read stuff about artificial intelligence. I remember very specifically an article in Scientific American by Marvin Minsky at the MIT AI lab, and very impressed by it. But I took a detour, which is the Fulbright advisor on campus, Fulbright Scholarship, said, "You're a really good student, you're doing interesting stuff, you should go abroad on a Fulbright."
Okay.
And I said, I don't, first of all, I haven't studied any languages except a little bit of Russian. And in those days, you could not go to Russia on a Fulbright. Probably can't now either. But anyway, so it's got to be English speaking.
Right.
And in my ignorance, I said, there's no computer stuff anywhere outside of the US. Right? I mean, I know the history of how computers started in England, right? And all that. So I found this group at University College London that was doing a combination of language, it's called a linguistic communication something. Wasn't computer specific, but it was looking at language from that kind of view. So I went to London for a year, which was a great experience. Lots of reasons in addition to the academics. And I had applied to MIT to the AI program there. And so when I came back from my Fulbright, I went to MIT. I was officially in applied mathematics. There was no such thing as computer science there. There still isn't. I think they call it electrical engineering and whatever. But and it was just in the era when, for the first time, ordinary hackers, MIT students, right, could get their hands on real computers. Because up until then, they'd only been the military and big business and so on who could afford a computer. And this was when ARPA, the Advanced Research, Defense Department Research Agency, funded a series of schools around the country to do artificial intelligence research.
This is what time around?
Mid-60s.
Mid-60s, okay.
So one was Stanford, one was MIT, one was Carnegie. So all of a sudden, these people who actually, the lineage at MIT of the students who went into there were part of the Tech Model Railway Club.
Okay.
And they had spent years developing this incredible layout of automated train stuff, right? Using old electronic stuff, right? Not computers. And then they got computers and they said, wow, that's even better. So there was this huge enthusiasm, this sort of sense of, we have these new machines. Nobody has ever had access to these kinds of things for the kind of stuff we're doing, right? They only had access for official stuff. So we can do all sorts of new and wonderful things. And that was the spirit at the AI lab.
And what eventually brought you to Silicon Valley?
So I finished my PhD at MIT, and I taught there for a couple of years while my wife was finishing medical school. So she was in medical school at Boston University. And I said, I've been at MIT, which is sort of the pinnacle of where I could expect to be in my career. So I'm willing to say the next 3 years, we're going to go wherever you get the best experience. I'll find something there that's reasonable to do. And then after 3 years, we'll decide. Okay. So she looked at programs. She looked at a program in Miami. She looked at a program in San Francisco, at San Francisco General Hospital, which was very well suited to what she wanted to do. So I came to Stanford, and I said, I'm maybe going to be in the area for a while. Is there anything I can do? And they said, well, we have a faculty member who is not just in your field, but in your sub-field. He's doing AI natural language work, which in those days there were a handful in the whole world who were doing that. Roger Schenk was his name. And he's going for a year of sabbatical at Yale. So if you want to come and be a, quote, acting assistant professor, which is the title for people who are temporary, for that year, then we'll sort of see what works out. He never came back.
Wow.
He stayed at Yale.
Wow. and you stayed here.
So I stayed here. So I never really did a real job interview. I never did I never did a job search. I was like, okay, I'm going to be here and let's see what happens. And okay, I'll stay. That was it.
How do you feel about the progress that has been made, I guess, in natural language processing from then to now?
So there's been a huge discontinuity. So when I was doing natural language processing, it was part of the paradigm which John Hoagland called good old-fashioned AI. You'll see that acronym, GOFAI, GOFAI, which was the classic way of doing AI, which is you had representations and logical manipulations and algorithms over the representations. And that's what my own dissertation was, the kind of work that I did, the kind of work everybody at the MIT AI lab was doing, and here at Stanford as well. And there was this fringe work on what were called perceptrons. It's primitive neural nets. I mean, neural nets have been around forever. In fact, Minsky, who was my advisor at MIT AI lab, did his dissertation on neural nets at Princeton before he came to MIT, but he was completely disillusioned by them. And he and my advisor, Seymour Papert, wrote a book called Perceptrons, which said, we can prove that a one-layer neural net system can never learn the following important things. They were right. But that one layer was the catch, right? And the answer is there was no way, given the technology of the day, to do anything more sophisticated than one layer. So there was a sort of undercurrent of people doing perceptron, doing neural net stuff, but it was all very, very primitive. So, fast forward Moore's law by some number of iterations, and all of a sudden you've got the amount of computing power and of course, internet and huge amounts of available data, that things that were completely impossible with the technology and the data of that day became possible. And the methods are completely orthogonal to what we were doing. I mean, they're not based on logical representations at all. They're based on statistical manipulations over large bodies of data. And I was as shocked as anybody when I saw what I could do.
Really?
Because I was steeped in this old neural nets are a curiosity. They can't do much, right?
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, along came GPT and all those things. And you say, wow, can it do that without really having any sense of meaning, without having any semantics, just doing statistical manipulations with multiple layers and all that stuff? I was, as I say, as surprised as anybody that it could actually do that. And when anybody asks about my own view, I don't understand how current AI works. I mean, I read the popular press level of description, but if you say, how do they manipulate the matrices of this, that, and the other, I have no idea. So I'm more interested in what you can do with it, who's doing it with it, not how do the gears turn.
Fair enough. And so I guess on that topic, how has governance or like government regulation or involvement in technology from your perspective kind of evolved over time, and how do you perceive it needing to evolve to kind of meet what AI can do now?
There's been a lot of evolution of the relationship between government and technology. Before World War II, basically, they stayed out. Technology is for eggheads, not for real government. And then, of course, World War II and the development of computers and the development of the nuclear weapons. And they said, hey, this science stuff really is going to get somewhere. We should fund it. And they created the Office of Scientific, whatever it was called. And then Sputnik went up. And they said, hey, the Russians are up there and we're not. We got to do something. So that's when ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agencies, started funding artificial intelligence research.
Okay.
And they said, okay, we need to get ahead on this stuff. We don't know what exactly it is, we don't know what it's going to do, but we just can't let ourselves get behind. And they really gave a huge amount of latitude. I mean, the labs that I was in did not work on military problems at all.
Yeah.
They worked on children's stories, random stuff, with the idea that you'd get to the basic science by taking simple tasks. So the relationship between government and technology was sort of, the government was cheerleading from the side and putting in some money. And then along came the Reagan era. And this is when I got involved in Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility, an organization I was one of the founders of.
Wow.
And what was happening is that Reagan, and not just him, of course, the government, was saying, we're going to create technologies that save us from nuclear attack. Which was an invulnerable, make nuclear weapons impotent, was the language. And as computer scientists, we knew this was not a feasible thing because you had this huge, complicated system, more complicated than any computer system ever built, and it had to work right the first time with no testing. And anybody who's in the computing business says, "Wait a minute, you can't do that." Of course, if you're in the military business, you don't have that sensibility. So we started a organization that was criticizing the overhype, the overemphasis on the technology is going to just work, and said, let's be realistic about what it can do. Also on other issues like privacy. It was back in those days, it was databases. It wasn't online. But you could see that if you look forward enough time, people were going to be tracked and monitored and so on. And you wanted to get ahead of that. So in those days, I think nobody was looking to the government to do regulation. The question is, how do you control what the government does?
Right.
And then along came, I think the real turning point in the regulation stuff was social media. So along came social media, and everybody could see there were problems. It was doing bad things. It was doing good things, that's true, but it was also doing bad things. And the obvious question is, who's in charge? Who's in control? One of our slogans from Computer Professionals was, technology is driving the future. Who's steering? And that's the question. Who actually has the ability to steer the direction it goes to good things and away from bad things and so on? And of course, the world is very different today than it was back in those days in terms of the control that major companies have. So you've got companies like Google and Meta and all those that have a tremendous amount of power because they do it. They've got the money, they've got the machines. If they want to do research on something, they do it. They don't need government money. Right? So government is now playing from the sidelines saying, well, what can we do when we don't really have much power over these companies? And Europe has taken a somewhat different turn. That they've always been more friendly towards the idea of government regulation. The US has a whole allergic reaction since Reagan and before that. And so they said, okay, we need to create commissions, we need to come up with rules, we need to come up with all sorts of stuff, policies, to help steer, to see that it goes in good directions and that it doesn't get exploited in bad directions. And what they have learned, as everybody else, is that's very hard to do. Right. Because you're in a multiplayer game. Each player has their own set of motivations and rules. So China is a player as a country. Google is a player as a company. And if you say they should do such and such, yeah, good luck. I mean, who tells them what they should do? And if you start trying to regulate, then you get into the trap, which is it's very, very hard to regulate something that's open-ended without over-regulating. If you say, stop, don't do it, that makes logical sense, but it's not what you want. If you said, okay, we'll do it, but put on guardrails and do this and do that and have commissions and have committees, and every little bit sort of tries to chip away at the dangers, but it's very hard to do it. So I'm not, I think it needs to be regulated. I'm not optimistic that the mechanisms that exist for doing regulation are going to be very successful at doing that.
And how do you feel about the European regulations?
I think they're trying to do something right. I think they're falling into the problem of when you try to do something right, you get part of it right and part of it wrong, and then the parts that are wrong come back to bite you. The privacy regulations in Europe are the obvious example. Before the AI sort of tagging along. As I said, a lot of the social concerns that we have really grew out of the privacy and social media stuff. At some level, you can say these are great. Another level, you get the other argument, which is, well, if we put any kind of regulations to slow us down, China's going to win. And you get this sort of reflexive China reaction you saw last night in the debate.
What are the social bodies and councils that you're a part of, or have been
the
a part
only
of?
thing that I'm actively engaged in, I'm not part of the official councils. Stanford has a program called the Center for Human-Centered AI. Actually, the centered goes away. It's HAI is their acronym, which was put together by Fei-Fei Li, who's one of the main researchers on AI, and a group of people working with her. It wasn't just her. They do a variety of things. They fund regular research. They fund students doing interesting new projects. And they also fund a lot of meetings. They have a boot camp for congressional aides where they bring in congressional aides and try to teach them what AI is and what it's about. Because you're not going to get good regulation if the people doing it don't understand what they're doing. I went there had an interesting meeting on regulation. They had somebody from the EU who's in the regulating, somebody who's from the African Union, interestingly enough, somebody who's from the whatever the right agency is in the US government. And it was part of my hesitation as to whether they're going to be able to really do regulation come from what they all said in that meeting. So I'm attending those kinds of things. I'm not leading on them.
And in those meetings, are you optimistic, or do you walk out of them saying the same thing, kind of, it's almost impossible to regulate technology because it's open-ended, and that you don't want to stifle innovation? Like, there's no.
Well, it's not so much that. I mean, as I said, it's not that you don't want to stifle innovation. It's that there are too many powerful forces that want to do what they want to do. So innovation isn't the danger. The danger is it's going to be sideswiped and taken over by people who have not necessarily the motives that you do, and they've got the money. So you can't just say, oh, well, we can stop them. I mean, in some sense, I mean, even without getting into the intricacies of how lobbying works, money rules.
When did from your perspective, like, what was the evolution from technology being funded from, you mentioned in the military, and then slowly it became in academia, and then eventually it became startup culture? Can you talk a little bit about, I guess, the relationship between academia and startup culture, and kind of that progression of how technology kind of became more, independently funded?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, in the early days, the military was the dominant funder.
Right.
And then NSF, National Science Foundation, came in and started having programs that were significant. They had minor stuff before that, but where it wasn't specifically military, but it was national interest, right, if you want to put it that way. And in fact, the project which started Google, right, so this is the so-called Digital Libraries Project at Stanford, which I was one of the principal investigators for, was sponsored by a consortium of government agencies, which included the military, but to a small degree also National Science Foundation, National Library of Medicine. So there was a lot of funding, and the money was going into universities. Right? They were funding the work we were doing at Stanford and at Berkeley and at CMU and a lot of other places. And
Stanford was in turn funding Google?
No.
No. Or this database?
Stanford never funded Google. That's an interesting question, what you said about funding. Stanford provided a cradle, a matrix in the biological sense, not the Matrix movie, where things could emerge, things could grow. And what became Google grew in that emerging soup of stuff.
You called it the data. You were the principal investigator on the
digital libraries.
Digital libraries.
And it was interesting what happened. Again, this is the history of the field, but at the time we started that project, the notion of online information was dominated by professional, specialized data silos. So if you're interested in law, there was LexisNexis, and it had legal stuff online. If you're interested in medicine, there was National Library of Medicine, they had medical stuff online, and so on and so on and so on. And each of those had its own arcane way of accessing it and knowing what was in it. You had to hire a reference librarian who knew how to use it, and all that kind of stuff. And so what this project said is, couldn't we have something that's more like a human library, where anybody who knows basic computing and stuff can go in and access this stuff? What we missed was that the stuff we were talking about accessing wasn't going to be the future of where the information was. This is before the web. Right? So this project got started really just before the web came along. And all of a sudden, with HTML, HTTP, I mean, all the stuff that we now take for granted, any old student, any schmo anywhere could put stuff online, and other people anywhere could access it. which was crazy. I mean,
Yes.
from our point of view, it's not properly curated.
Right.
It's not properly vetted. It's not real information. It's just junk that people put there.
Yeah.
Well, it turns out, junk wins. So all of a sudden there was this surge of stuff that was getting put onto the internet and through the web, but internet more broadly. That was completely unstructured, uncontrolled. It was just random stuff. And what the insight was of Larry and Sergey was to say, we could index that. We don't need things that have been carefully indexed by experts. We can have a way to index whatever stuff is out there and to provide good pointers into which things out of that sea of stuff you wanted to get. And so they were working on what became Google at Stanford. It started called Backrub in the original name because it did use backlinks. It was very clear that they weren't the first search engine, right? I mean, when they came along, I was using Alta Vista and Lycos, and there was a whole bunch. But as soon as I used Google, I said, this is much better. Right. This works a lot better. So at that point, I had meetings. I actually met with some venture capitalists with them so on. And I said, this is a really good search engine. You could probably make a nice chunk of money if you sold it to Microsoft or to one of the big companies that would like to include search in their portfolio and so on. As I often say, I'm glad they took my technical advice, not my business advice. Because they did. They tried to sell it, actually.
Oh, wow.
But they wanted a lot more money. They thought it was worth a lot more than the people they were trying to sell it to did. And they said, why don't we just make an independent search engine company? And I said, how are you going to make money? I understand if somebody pays you for it. They said, and to be honest, Larry said, well, we'll figure that out.
Yeah.
Because they didn't have the advertising model at that point. There were companies that had, like Bill Gross's company, that had advertising models, but they had much worse search engines.
Right.
So they said, we'll start a company. Now, having said that, they were able to bring in a lot of money.
Right.
Whereas when they started Google, to have enough funding, to have enough computers to do things like that, you had to be in a university.
Yeah. Okay.
And by the time they'd been out there a few years, the answer is you had to have good angel investors. They would give you the money. You just had to go do the stuff. And so there was this big switch, and it went on. I mean, Silicon Valley has been doing this for decades, but I think the information side of it, the Google type side of it, was in the past 30 years, however, whatever the right time frame is, where all of a sudden a lot of people who had money said, we can make a fortune if we put money into this,
Right.
which shifted the equation as to who's putting money in.
Right. I'm still curious to dig in a little bit there, though. Like the relationship between, I guess, academia, maybe even specifically, it could be Stanford, and like the startup culture of Silicon Valley. How has it kind of evolved over the years, in your opinion?
Well, it evolved. I mean, the startup culture of Silicon Valley goes back to things like Fairchild Semiconductor.
Yeah.
Right. If you say what were the first startups in quote Silicon Valley, they weren't computer software.
No silicon chips.
They were building transistors, right, which then they could put into chips and so on and so on. So there was a culture here of, Sand Hill Road investors that started with a very different set of companies than what we think of as the startup culture today. It wasn't everybody builds their app.
Yeah.
That gradually evolved as the opportunities came up to say, well, instead of putting money into another chip company, put it that way, let's try something that's pure software. Pure software was a dare, right? I mean, how could you make money in pure software, right? I mean, and the answer was, we'll figure it out. We'll get it. And then you say, how can we do it? By selling pet food on the web, right? Well, it turns out that didn't work as well. But as always, when you have this kind of open-ended venture funding, you try everything, right?
Yeah.
I mean, as people say, if one in 10 company really succeeds, that's great. You don't need to win on every one you try.
Fair enough.
Which again is very different. And I think that if you're talking about culture, because the government funding culture is give it to a bunch of experts, and if they agree it's likely to work, then we'll fund it. They have review panels, a whole kind of stuff.
Right.
So in order to fund something in general, it's got to be pretty conservative. It's got to be something which is within the envelope of what the people already in the field think is going to work. Whereas with venture capitalists, it's more like Las Vegas, right? I mean, you say, well, this is crazy, but let's give it a try, right? I mean, if it comes out big, I make a lot of money.
I'm curious about a little bit your philosophical stance on kind of more modern AI now, and the idea of how AI might challenge our understanding of kind of the value of human life, the value of work, you know, and really what it means to be human. Do you have any thoughts on any of that?
Well, let me separate out the work part from the others, because I think
Okay.
the work part is something we've dealt with ever since the Industrial Revolution.
Okay, fair
Right?
enough.
I mean, I remember when I was growing up, there was a song about John Henry, who was a steel-driving man who had his hammer, right?
Yes.
And he was completely pushed away by the steam engine. So it's always been the case that new technologies change the nature of jobs.
Okay.
So I believe that's going to happen. I can't tell you exactly which jobs because it's a little trickier, but you know, it's pretty obvious that there's employment shifts. So that's going to happen, and it's we say a well-known economic issue.
Sure.
It's going to be different in detail for sure. Are computers going to become sentient beings? And my answer is that's a matter of how you implement and choose to use them. Autonomy is not something that a computer has. It's something that is granted to it by the way you install it, use it, build it, and employ it.
Right.
So we have a choice, who's steering. We have a choice of where are we going to let computers take on autonomous functions. They just do it and we don't have to control it. And where do we say, no, that's got to be something humans do. Again, going back to the old issue of nuclear war, that you don't want an autonomous computer choosing when to drop the bombs.
Right.
Because the consequences are too big. And the chance that it will do something that it will, quote, fantasize, or what's the word?
Hallucinate.
Hallucinate, right?
Yes.
The chance to hallucinate, you don't want to take, right?
Right.
I think the real question that's behind what you asked is how does having AI affect our views of people? So once I have a machine that can write a piece of text that makes sense or seems to make sense, what do I think about students who are spending time in school learning to write text that makes sense? And how much do I value what they do, and how much do I value what we think of as intelligence?
Yes.
And that's, I think that's one of those steering questions. I mean, look back again at social media, which once you lose the sense of authority and truth, and anybody can post something on Twitter which makes sense to them and completely crazy to somebody else, but they're as much an authority as anybody else, right? You don't say, well, it's the New York Times, it has to be right.
Right.
And that's having an effect on how we relate to other people. And I think the same is going to be true with AI, that once we have machines that are doing things that are in some ways a mimic of what people do,
Yeah.
then how does that? There's a guy named John Hoagland, I think I mentioned him earlier because he coined the good old-fashioned AI thing. And his most famous quote is, "The problem with computers is they don't give a damn." And I think that gets to the basic thing. That is, if we say, what does this LLM model think about this issue? It doesn't. It doesn't have an issue. It doesn't have a thought. It simply churns together the statistics on the words. Now, for some purposes, that's fine. You say, okay, I can use that for advertising.
Yeah.
Great. For other purposes, you want to assume that if you're interacting with something or some person, they have skin in the game.
Right.
They actually care at some level. They may have bad intentions. It doesn't mean that they have your benefit in mind. But they're not just parroting. They're actually thinking about consequences. And I think that's what's missing from current AI. There's no sense of thinking about consequences. It's just churning out the details. And the question for people is, when do you say that's not acceptable? And when do you say, sure, good enough?
Where do you draw the line?
I'm happy with all of the functional things. If you say, can it help me write my resume? Sure, great, it helps me write my resume. If you say, can it write news articles? Well, now we're pushing a little boundary, because when I read a news article, many of the news articles I read would not be any worse if they were done by AI, for sure. But I really want something that has some insight and some skin in the game, right? Some concern. And it's not going to have that. So how do I distinguish between those? So I think there's the boundaries for where there's Joe Weizenbaum is actually a very interesting guy. He was at MIT in the faculty when I came there as a student. And he wrote a book called Computer Calculation and Human Reason, something, those words basically. And what he said is computers can this is now 1950s, right? We're talking long time ago. He wrote a program called ELIZA, which a lot of people have seen, which was the world's first real chatbot.
Okay.
And it actually fooled people.
Yeah.
This is now 70 years ago. It fooled people. So none of this is brand new. I mean, it's of course way more sophisticated now. And what he said is that there are some things which require calculation. Computers are great at that. And there are some things which require judgment, and judgment's a human quality based on more of a social, political grounding. And computers, as we're using them now, don't have that. And it's our problem is how do we therefore assign jobs to who does what?
Which is complicated when there's so many different stakeholders involved in the decision making.
Exactly.
You've written a lot about AI embodiment. I'm curious if you could kind of explain that a little bit more and how that, I don't know, impacts our relationship with AI.
One of the things that I've written about in conjunction with my colleague Fernando Flores is the relationship between AI and the philosophy of existence ontology, and a lot of fancy words to get thrown in. But it's clear that when a person interacts with another person, with the world, with whatever they're doing, there's something more going on than a calculation.
Yes.
We have a body, we're engaged, we have concerns, we have cares, and most of that is subconscious, right? It's not like we say, okay, let's see, my concern is X, therefore I do. We do occasionally, but most of the time we respond. And it's what Heidegger, the philosopher, called thrownness. You're thrown into a situation, right? You don't step back and see it. So how much of that is physical? And how much of being physical is, a robot's physical, right? If a robot is, computer is physical, right? We say, what's a computer? Well, you can argue abstraction and software and all that, but in the end, there is some physical device actually doing stuff, and that's embedded in a power system and in all sorts of stuff. So computers have always been, at some sense, physical. Now, what happens when you make that physical more of an imitation of what humans do physically? So now it's got arms and legs, it's doing all that kind of stuff. And how does that affect how you think of what it does? And as I say, it still doesn't give a damn. So that doesn't change the basic lack of care, lack of concern. But it means that certain kinds of activities can be programmed that require, vision is the obvious example in current AI, what we think of as sensory and motor activity. For me, it doesn't change my basic view of what the computer AI is or what it does, but it does change the scope of things that can be done with it.
I imagine you've heard of like Neuralink and these neural implants that exist. I'm curious what your thoughts are on kind of as we perceive a future where you might be able to download information. I don't know, does that change your perspective at all on education and the, kind of like, I don't know, the value of education and for humans and what they choose to pursue?
So value of education for humans is, of course, something that has been debated for millennia, if you want to put it. Plato or somebody argued that writing was terrible because it meant people didn't have to memorize things anymore. That society was being ruined by the idea that you could write everything down.
Wow.
That was a while back. There's a great short story called A Feeling of Power. It's the name of the story. I've forgotten who wrote it. About an era where nobody remembers how to do arithmetic at all. And then the calculator breaks, and all of a sudden this guy rediscovers multiplication, right? Nobody, you don't do long multiplication, long division anymore. They still teach it some in schools, but that's a legacy.
Yeah, interesting.
Penmanship, right? I was terrible in penmanship, and that was a problem. And they still teach it. They do, but most today they do keyboarding, right? It doesn't matter that you can move a pen in a certain way. So it's always, in terms of education, or just memorizing facts,
Yeah.
used to be that it was, made you a TV game show star, that you could remember millions of interesting, if not useful, facts about the world. And now who cares? You just look it up on Google, right? And you don't need to memorize those. So I think education is grounded in current society. What you need to be able to do depends on what the things around you can do. And so I think we're going to see shifts. I think there are things that we now think of as something every educated person should do that we say, no, let the machine do that. Critical thinking is not one of those, because critical thinking is going back to underlying concerns and cares. It's not just logic. Machines can do logic, that's great. But if you say, let's think critically about what that politician said in the debate, that's a different thing than just applying logic. And it's grounded in all sorts of stuff, human feelings, human responses. And I think that if you said, what do we need to do in education today? It's not teach people more coding. Right? It's great, they learn coding. But get them back to a sense of being able to do their own critical thinking about things and put things in context and understand subtle arguments. I mean, a whole set of things which are going away in the era of social media.
Yeah. Do you think that AI can eventually critically think?
No, I mean, I think it can produce results which look like critical thinking in some cases.
Right.
So that's fine. I mean, again, you want to pick those areas where it's doing it. If you say, is it really doing critical thinking? No, it's not really doing anything. It's piling together statistics.
What about bias in AI and bias in those statistics? Do you see that as like a big concern or not so much?
I think bias is an interesting societal question, of course. We have huge amounts of bias. Every person does. I mean, it's not a problem in the sense that you want to fix it. It's something we learn how to manage. I think there are some obvious cases of bias that are pretty easily dealt with. So you say, okay, facial recognition programs don't do so well on dark-skinned people's faces.
Yeah.
That's a bias. But yeah, you fix that. I mean, that's not inherent. That's just a matter of how much technology. It's because they've been trained on mostly white faces. Okay, so we need different training sets. Yeah. So if you pick a lot of these things which get the publicity about bias, it's not good that they're there, but they're solvable problems. Right? You say, okay, how do we adapt the training set? How do we adapt the algorithm and so on? And you can fix the things you can recognize. At a more subtle level, if you say, well, when you use an LLM, whatever it says is biased by the fact that the huge volume of data it has makes certain assumptions about the world.
Right.
And the language which comes out, therefore, is implicitly, not explicitly, but implicitly based on those assumptions because that's the text it had.
Yeah.
And again, you get obvious cases like languages, right? It's mostly English and all that kind of stuff. But I think there's a deep question about what does it mean for what we apply the word AI, intelligence, to be the averaging out of what's gone before. Right? And averaging in a very fancy mathematical sense, but it's not based on, I mean, some people who are biased really care about their biases.
Sure.
Right? And politics is full of that today.
Right.
But if you say an algorithm is biased, that's not the case. The algorithm doesn't care. It just happens to have been trained with a certain data set, or it happens, and again, there's structural bias, which is different. So if you say, what if you objectively apply various criteria, like where people grew up and this and that and the other, to decide if they can get a loan?
Right.
And the answer is, in our society, the factors that we think of as bias are there, whether we look for them or not. So you're going to have fewer blacks getting loans, right? And to fix that, you have to do something explicit. You can't just say, well, let's give it, because they do tend to come from neighborhoods where there's more crime, right? Sure. Now, you can say why. You can argue politically that's a pathology, not a way things should be, but it's just the fact of the way things are.
Right. Is there a perfect data set in your mind, or like should everyone have their own LLMs tailored to their own data sets that they create over their, I don't know, their adolescent lives? Or
it's an interesting question what data sets constitute. Most of the data sets that we think about today are so far magnitudes, orders of magnitude beyond what any one person's brain could ever experience.
Right.
That it doesn't make sense. I mean, the data about me is tiny, tiny, tiny compared to the data sets that make these systems work. So you could have data which is more, more of my experience and therefore likely to produce results which are shaded more towards where I am. But you're not going to replace trillions of bytes of data with my data.
No, but you do create, right now at least, we create specific use cases of AI based off of much smaller data sets that are more controllable, right? Say in the case of like trying to perfectly tailor resumes to job applications, you wouldn't just have any sort of data, you would have resume data and so on related to the career. Do you think that those larger models like the OpenAI's, is it the same type of progression that we saw with search engines early on, where you had these very specific search engines for, let's say, legal information versus getting a much larger one? Like, is that the progression that is just inevitable, having these large data sets that are less controllable, more of larger magnitude?
I'm out of my depth if I try to talk about the technology and how it works.
Fair enough.
But my sense is that as soon as you limit down the set of the data, you don't get as good a results because it just counts on the huge volume. I mean, that's why it's not a good model of human thought. I mean, it's clear that whatever it is going on in my head is not based on trillions of pieces of data.
Fair.
So I don't know enough to say. I mean, let me say it very clearly. I'm sure there are applications where smaller, limited data sets will do great jobs.
Right.
How much are those applications and where do they fit into the grand scheme of things is harder to say.
So what does concern you, like, if any, I guess, from technology or shifts in culture right now? Like, what are some of your top concerns?
Well, so, I mean, there are big concerns like climate. But let me stay with the sort of more limited technology-related, computer-related ones.
Sure.
I think, AI is playing into a larger picture, which has been going on with a lot of technologies from the past, including print and so on, but which was hugely accelerated by online media. So we're now in a world where the basic sharing of trust about what people say and what they do and so on has been shattered. And I think without trust, all of the other parts of society fall apart because they depend on trust. So if you said, what's my worry? That AI will accelerate, not that it will cause, but it will accelerate the sort of inability of people to really feel that they can be connected to and trust what they see from other people. And it all becomes tweets, right?
Yeah.
So that's my biggest social concern. I think on AI, I'm not worried that it's going to take over from us. I mean, I think, again, that's a choice that people who put it in place will have to make, but I think that's visible. But I think that it will be misused, that people will manipulate their communication with other people and with the world using AI. I mean, we saw it, great example this week, Taylor Swift, right? So she announced last night, one of the reasons I'm coming out in favor of Kamala now is because there was a fake news thing done by AI which said that I was
voting for Trump.
And, those are going to happen all the time.
In other emerging tech, like space exploration, do you see AI playing a role? Are you excited for emerging tech like that?
Is AI good for space exploration? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it does not require the kind of life support that humans do.
Right.
And I think Musk is crazy in saying we should get humans on Mars. We should get better computers on Mars and better robots on Mars. There's all sorts of things you can do without putting human bodies in that kind of danger. For all the, exploiting the minerals, doing exploration, whatever you want to do. I think computers have been and will continue to be a great source for that. Am I excited by that? I've never been a space junkie. I mean, I read science fiction in high school, right? I enjoyed that, but I think we have enough to deal with and think about here on Earth, and especially with other people, that going into the cosmos and the galaxies and so on, I mean, I enjoy a good movie now and then, but it's not something which motivates me.
I'm curious for like any insights you have or thoughts on the culture of tech and people, founders building tech companies and so on. Any perspectives on, I don't know, just how that's evolved over time?
Well, it's hard to talk about the founders and the tech companies without going back to the larger political economic context. I mean, look at the oil barons, or the railroad barons, Stanford University. Why is that there?
Yeah.
It's because Leland Stanford and a few of his friends put railroad tracks across Utah and cleverly bought up the land near the railroad tracks before they put them there, right? So there have been founders. I mean, I would say Leland Stanford would have fit perfectly well with Elon Musk, right? I mean, maybe not as bad, but anyway, when you have this kind of economic system, which is basically winner take all, I mean, the whole structure of how it works, you're going to get big egos. The people who succeed are not going to be the people who are quiet and thoughtful. They're the people who get out there and say, I think you may think this is crazy, but I'm going to do it. And 9 out of 10 times, they're totally crazy. But 1 time out of 10, they're right. And then they do it. And I think that builds a kind of my mental model we have of leaders and founders. That they should be the people who go out and say, you may think this is crazy. And in a exploitative way. I mean, Martin Luther King had that same thing. Many people thought he was crazy, and he had a vision. But that I'm going to strike it rich, right? Whether it's in the railroads or in online systems. And I think because we tend to, worship is too strong a word, but strongly praise and people who are successful. Right? I mean, Trump is trying to make his whole case on, well, I'm a billionaire.
Right.
You got to believe in me. A lot of people who are billionaires who are full of what. Other people who are really good. And I think being in that kind of position of power, all power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. I mean, I think it distorts people's way of thinking about themselves and the people around them. So I'm not, there are good founders. I'm not saying that being a founder is a bad thing, but I think that there are a lot of pathologies that emerge.
So on the topic of big egos then, I have to ask, do you have a perspective on Silicon Valley's relationship with psychedelics and kind of this new emerging, psychedelic assisted therapy field and its prevalence as well at Stanford now?
I don't know much about psychedelics. I mean, I'm old enough that I should, because I was in the first wave of psychedelics. And I took psilocybin once and some marijuana now and then, but that's my entire experience with it, so I don't have experience. But in those days, it was the hippie fringe.
Right.
It was the woo-woo crazies who were talking psychedelics and had no serious, useful consequences. And I think that wave basically pushed the way people thought about things for decades.
Right.
And then some people said, well, there's actually maybe some interesting things here. Yes, first of all, we're getting a better understanding of how it affects the brain's physiology, which in those days nobody had any idea, right? It was just take it and it's cool, right? And there may be places where it's useful. And of course, as with all these things, you then get the hype. People say, oh, it solves this problem, it solves that problem, it makes you this, it makes you that. 1 in 10 may be right, right? A lot of them are just wrong. And in fact, potentially damaging, because putting stuff in your brain is not consequence-free.
Sure.
So I'm not against psychedelics. If somebody were to say, we did this medical study and it's a way to get rid of depression, okay, good. Which people, which kind of depression? You don't want to blanket and say, oh, it's good for this.
Right.
But it's worth studying and it's worth making available in the right ways. I tend to be, cautious. I'm pro-FDA, right?
Yes.
I mean, I don't believe in just try anything and see what happens.
Fair enough.
Kool-Aid acid test, right? But with enough care, you can do useful things. So I don't see psychedelics as changing society in a major way, but I do see them being used for interesting, important things.
Yeah. What are you optimistic, given all of the different players that you talked about throughout this that are at odds with each other, and the egos and the desire to make tons of money and this winner-takes-all system? Are you optimistic that where we're going with all of this technology and this progress is going to be great for humanity, or are you generally kind of on the fence?
So I'm certainly not blindly optimistic it's going to be great. If you say, oh, this is going to be great, this is going to be great, that's hype, right? And
Sure.
it's always useful for getting people enthused, but it's not true.
Sure.
Now, the opposite is the doomers. This is going to be terrible, it's going to ruin everything. And most of the time, I don't agree with that either. Society and humanity and biology are pretty good at adapting over eons.
Yeah.
I mean, things are going to change. Some of them are good, some are bad. Even take global warming. I mean, I think global warming is going to cause terrible economic consequences. And I think human beings will survive. And I don't think it's going to be the end of life on Earth. I think it's going to be major disruption and so on. So I think the same thing about a lot of these computer things. I think we don't know for sure what the consequences are going to be.
Yeah.
But it's not going to be, it's great, don't worry about it.
Yeah. What were your final words of wisdom, I guess, to like young founders today?
Well, for young founders, and a founder is an interesting category of people because you don't get born to be a founder, right?
No.
You decide that's a career you want. Ask why you're doing it. I mean, I think there are people who are founders who basically say, I'm doing this because I'm going to make a lot of money.
Yeah.
And I can not like their social political views, but if they're honest about that,
Yeah.
then they need to pursue it. I think, from my point of view, that people who are going to be doing things which they believe can change society and change the world should be asking, what is this going to do for the world? Not just what is it going to do for my pocketbook, but what is it going to do for people? And once you get into that, there's disadvantaged groups and there's the environment. I mean, it turns out life is complicated. It's not like you can say, well, this is the right thing to do. You can say, okay, so there's this and this and this, and on balance, I think I should push it this way. And there are a lot of people, I think a lot of young people today who are going into what you might call mixed mode, where they are thinking about making money, but they're also thinking about what are the consequences going to be, and is this good? Who is this good for, and who is it bad for, and how do we try to improve that?
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Is there any piece of technology or I don't know, any information that we didn't talk about today that you are excited about that you would want to note?
So I hate to admit this, having been a professor of computer science in Silicon Valley and so on, but I'm not much of a tech adopter.
Okay.
I mean, I don't use voice control
At all?
at all. I don't use Alexa. I don't use on my phone. I mean, I still type, right? Now, you could say, well, but you could be getting things done more efficiently if you did that. And the answer is, I'm sure I could. Efficiency is not the only thing in the world. And so I don't tend to get excited. I mean, I can get excited in the large, like how is this solar technology going to help us deal with warming? I mean, that's exciting. But it's not like, here's this gadget and I just have to have it. There's actually very few gadgets I have to have.
And there's not many problems in your life that you think, this would be optimized better by technology?
No. I mean, there are things which I say I could probably be more efficient. I
Okay.
recognize that, and I accept that, but it's not going to solve the problems.
And efficiency is not everything, too.
Right.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you so much for making time to speak with
Okay,
me today and
that's
answer all
fun.
my questions.
Since I'm not teaching classes anymore, it's always exciting to get a chance to interact.
It's my pleasure, so thank you. Yeah.
All right. Thank
This
you.
is Dr. Winograd.